What is up, squad? It is your Squid, aka Jules Centauri, the anxious squid, coming at you with another one of your favourites, one for the Storytime with Jules playlist. Number 4 in the playlist, I think. It's a playlist consisting of Australian history stories that I find interesting and hope to entertain you with or inform you about. This one hits the mark on a bunch of my interests at once, so I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. The following video is about John Macarthur, and it's a bit different from the others in this playlist, in the sense that I'll be making the case for him being bipolar, or suffering from bipolar disorder, or having bipolar disorder, or however you would want to word it. Generally, I tell you guys stuff that is ironclad fact, and this video will have a bunch of those in it for sure, but the purpose is to try and fill some of the space between what we know and what we don't. And I'd love to know what your perspective is and how it compares to mine in the comment section below. Before we get too far into the video where I'm diagnosing someone with a mental illness without a medical degree, 190 odd years after they died, I just want to get some trigger warnings and obvious intellectual qualifiers out of the way here. We're going to be talking about bipolar disorder, the common actions or behaviours associated with bipolar disorder, as well as the perceptions and understandings of people with what we now know as bipolar disorder, framed in the early 1800s. There will also be parts of the discussion that focus on his wife Elizabeth and their rocky relationship, or the rough time he caused her and their sons. This will all have the potential to be a little confronting for anyone who has bipolar disorder or loves someone who has bipolar disorder. So I won't be offended if you choose to click away right now. This is your chance. Go watch some of my other videos and give me your watch minutes in that way. No one loses. We're all good. That being said though, I also understand that I might annoy some people simply by diagnosing someone with bipolar who's long been dead and whose shortcomings have been extensively written about in other contexts. To those people, I would simply say the comments section is all yours. I'm not trying to excuse poor behaviour by laying the case for Macarthur being bipolar. I'm trying to provide a new context or a new light for us to view him in, to help us understand those negative actions and his reasons for taking them, potentially, anyway. It won't suddenly make him a great bloke, but I'm open to the discussion of it. What I'm trying to say is that a diagnosis is definitely not an excuse for poor behaviour, but I think sometimes it can be a reason to explain it, and I hope you can see the difference between the two. Full disclosure, I have bipolar myself, or I am bipolar myself, or whatever language you want to use. My brain is different from the majority of the populations, like I think John Macarthur's was. Without going off track too much, we'll stick with John, but I want to explain my context. Before my diagnosis, I was behaving in some pretty poisonous ways, let's just put it that way. Poisonous to myself and to other people. Once I cracked the code, or more accurately, once my psychologist Michelle cracked the code, after a good year or so of therapy, I legitimately changed as a person. I'm far more in control of my mood-related behaviour now than I ever have been, and this means that the actions I take, and fundamentally the person I'm perceived as now, is different to what it was prior to my diagnosis, which was about 2 years ago. So the people I hurt are still hurt, and I can't change what I did, and no one has to accept poor treatment from someone just because that someone finds out they're a bit loopy later on, right? But some bridges stay burned, but I can reconcile with myself that I was flying blind previously, right? And now I have the correct tools to be, for lack of a better word or term, a normal person. The process of self-realization and the self-assessment I had to go through to get to that point was really hard for me, but the point I'm making by telling you all that is that it would have been much, much harder for me if the entire fucking world didn't even know bipolar existed, and was as common as 1 in every 100 damn people. I wouldn't have figured it out on my own, so I sympathise with people who display the symptoms of bipolar throughout history because they were expected to do just that, figure it out on their own. I'm sure you get what I'm saying, but yeah, that's where I'm coming from in the making of this video, and we'll get on with it now. A quick Google search lists the medical definition of bipolar disorder today in 2019 as the following.
Bipolar disorder, also known as manic depression, is a mental illness that brings severe high and low moods and changes in sleep, energy, thinking, and behaviour. People who have bipolar disorder can have periods in which they feel overly happy and energized, and other periods of feeling very sad, hopeless, and sluggish.
let's compare that to these two statements about Macarthur. Okay, one being a description of Macarthur by the then Governor of New South Wales, Philip Gidley King, in 1801, and then the other being the official declaration of Macarthur's insanity in 1832.
Experience has convinced every man in this colony that there are no resources which art, cunning, impudence, and a pair of basilisk eyes can afford that he does not put in practice to obtain any point he undertakes.
Maybe I'm just envisioning the gusto I attack things with in my hypomanic moods, but that sounds a lot like mania to me.
He is now like a wayward child. He remains at home brooding, though I expect not altogether idle. For these last 3 months past, he has been so depressed of his reason or understanding that he is altogether unfit and unable to govern himself or his affairs.
And that sounds a lot like severe depression to me as well. According to WebMD, recognizing bipolar involves observing the following characteristics in yourself. Seemingly sudden periods of anger, seeing yourself as far more important than you actually are in the grand scheme of things, being quick to frustration while focusing, not needing a lot of sleep or needing much larger quantities of sleep, it can go either way, random impulses to do things that are out of character or brash, especially in regards to money, moodiness, and confusion or inattention during otherwise simple tasks. Incidentally, that list is why it's so hard for even for doctors to accurately diagnose folks with mental health issues. Because things like ADD, ADHD, all the variants of bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, like all of those have symptoms that are incredibly similar to that list. If you take anything out of this video, it should be that, like, not to trust me or your judgment based off a Google search or anything like that. See a psychologist if you feel like any of those things describe your life. See a few even. It took over 18 months to figure out what was happening in my head. But yeah, we're going to spend the next 5 minutes trying to figure out what was happening in John's, or John Macarthur's. And I'm going to leave the dot points up on the screen, maybe here in Australia, while I do. Just in case you were wondering, Macarthur area where he lived is in here, around in Sydney, same sort of area that I filmed the last video for, the Razorback truck protest that happened in the Wollondilly is a part of Macarthur. But anyway, Macarthur and his wife Elizabeth were part of what's known as the Second Fleet to Australia, initially on board the Neptune, which Macarthur would later describe as the worst ship in the worst fleet of ships ever to sail. Pretty strong words, considering that before the Neptune even left the dock, our boy Johnny Mac had already gotten in an argument, duelled, and beaten the ship's captain, and then done this exact same thing with the captain that followed him as well. He and his wife were transferred by the third captain of the Neptune to the Scarborough, a different ship in the fleet, for the journey to Australia. But yeah, why would anyone bring their wife along, then cause such a fuss with the two separate captains anyway? She was the first soldier's wife to come to Australia, so they would have known it was a risky or momentous occasion, or at the very least a big-ish deal for the new colony. Perhaps due to the increased anxiety of the coming voyage, John was unable to keep his emotions in check. Perhaps he was rapid cycling due to the thought of being on the ship for some months. Could it be that John was suffering delusions of grandeur even, because of the whole first wife of a soldier coming along thing? Did he maybe have a higher opinion of himself than reality would suggest, given he was bringing his wife in the first place? I don't know about you, but I reckon that particular theory is supported by a quote from one of his early contemporaries, Naval Governor John Hunter.
Scarcely anything short of the full power of the governor would be considered by this person as sufficient for conducting the duties of his office.
To be honest, it sounds to me like Macarthur thought of himself as the father of an aristocracy in Australia, and I'm not the first to have suggested it. Macarthur really disliked the notion of convicts being granted lands and titles, and I mean, from his perspective, you can't really blame him. What was the point of a trip halfway around the world as a soldier to be granted free land if when you arrived you were the same class as a criminal who got the same amount of land as you next door anyway? He often agitated for local law enforcement or politicians to be out of favour in the public eye whenever they made decisions that did not personally favour him. In fact, one of the conditions of his return to Australia after facing trial for his part in the Rum Rebellion was not to meddle in public affairs. And, by the way, I will do a video on the Rum Rebellion at some point. don't worry about that. Check my channel and see if it's already there if you're watching this at some point in the future. Don't forget to hit subscribe as well for more content like this. But where were we? Macarthur wanted there to be a clear and sharp divide, a class divide in Australia. The convict class and the business owning class. The former of which would provide free labour for life to the latter. Indeed, at some point in 1819, Macarthur suggested that the ideal Australia would exclusively be properties intended for farming the entire country wide. He suggested a minimum of 4,000 hectares for each property, and that the owners of each property would utilise convict labour, both in order to keep the convicts landless and to keep them in proper subjugation. Maybe I'm adding the tone of malice in my head when I read that quote, but I can really see his issues with convicts being allowed lands or businesses after their sentences being laid to bear here. Macarthur's dominant personality showed a strong sense of personal superiority by almost all accounts. This is based off almost no evidence other than living inside my own brain, but I think his arrogance concealed an anxious insecurity that led him towards taking risks and always chasing new or quick bucks. That was certainly the case for me with my unchecked mental health. I was always chasing the next thing to do that would impress people. Some have even argued that starting a YouTube channel is a continuation of that theme, but I digress. Macarthur's growing wool business and the stock and influence that came as a result of it were not due to his business nous. They were mostly due to his wife Elizabeth's hard work, to be honest. John Macarthur had other mercantile interests, few of which were ever successful, and it's largely due to Elizabeth Macarthur's drive and tenacity between 1809 and 1817 that John's business did so well. It's also down to all that free convict labour she had, mostly consisting of petty thieves or Irish freedom fighters that had been shipped halfway across the world to be slaves as punishment, but we don't really talk about that. We will talk about that, seriously. Hit subscribe, it's down there. They didn't all still leave some loaves of bread. I'll do a video on that soon. But yeah, one of the more sympathetic of Macarthur's critics that I've been reading in the last few days believed that he knew no medium between friendship and enmity, which, from what I can gather, basically either meant that he went from 0 to 10 really quickly, or he didn't have acquaintances, merely friends or foes. Perhaps he had a problem with oversharing with people he hardly knew, like I do. He was apparently humourless and an absolute stranger to self-criticism, which is completely unlike myself, and he constantly assumed that he was the smartest person in any given room. Any argument or political scuffle Macarthur was involved in resulted in vicious barbs from his side almost from the outset. If someone of worth was to take it too far in the burgeoning colony that was New South Wales, you could trust that that individual would probably be John Macarthur. Macarthur boasted himself to Governor Darling that he had never yet failed in ruining a man who had become obnoxious to him. And at the end of the day, and nearing the end of this video, it's hard to put a finger on if you, either way, you know, especially nearly 200 years down the line. John Macarthur was declared insane before the end of his days anyway, and to be quite frank, he was bloody lucky he was a white bloke with some cash. Insane asylums weren't fun back then. I don't imagine they ever were fun, actually, but he'd likely have gone to one if he were anyone other than himself at that time in history. It's pretty messed up to think about all the people those places consumed, but that's another video. That's it for this one. Anyway, so let me know what you think in the comments below. I actually don't think we'll ever know if John Macarthur was bipolar. Some things we do know, though, are that Henry Anthill was buried upright in the nearby hills of Picton, around the same time as all the stuff I was just talking about in this video. So hit subscribe, come back next week for that video, and yeah, let me know in the comments if you think, based on any evidence that I presented or that you've seen, that John Macarthur is bipolar, because I'm convinced. I'll see you when I look at you.